Today's TripAdvisor trip takes us to Cabrillo National Monument in San Diego, California, USA. Of the 50 states in the United States, where do you think the most people live? The answer is California. California is home to more than 38 million people and is the third largest state in the US after Alaska and Texas. If California were to become a sovereign state, it would be the fifth largest economy in the world. But here's the question of the day: who was the first European to reach California? The answer is Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. To talk about Cabrillo, we have to start with another famous person: Hernan Cortes. Cortes had ambitions to go after the gold of the Aztec Empire. So, disobeying orders from the Viceroy of Cuba not to go, he led just 300 men into what is now Mexico. And he took over the Aztec Empire, which was actually millions of people, and this is 1521. It was not all smooth sailing, actually. The biggest threat to Cortes was when the Viceroy of Cuba sent an army to suppress him. The Cuban Viceroy gave Pánfilo de Narváez 1,000 men to capture Cortes. Narváez is a character from TripAdvisor's History of Florida. And one of the men who joined Narváez's expedition was our hero, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. Cortes left the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in the hands of his most trusted subordinate, Pedro de Alvarado, and set out to fight Narváez. He's up against an army more than 3 times his size. And Cortes won. Narváez was wounded, losing an eye, and taken prisoner. Cabrillo surrendered and went on to work for Cortes. Narváez was later freed and led an unsuccessful expedition to Florida, dying off the coast of Texas. Only 4 survivors remained. Cortes founded Mexico City and ruled the region. The so-called New Spain was born. Cortes wasn't satisfied, though, and continued to explore and conquer the New World. In 1524, he sent Pedro de Alvarado, his second in command in the conquest of the Aztec Empire, on an expedition to what is now Guatemala. Accompanying him on this conquest was Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, a soldier who was skilled with the crossbow. The conquest of Guatemala was successful, and Cabrillo was able to acquire land, an encomienda, and a gold mine. With this economic foundation, Cabrillo traveled to Spain in 1531, where he met and married his wife. They had established a family in Guatemala. Cortes was also interested in the north. He wanted to explore California by sea. At the time, the Spaniards thought California was an island. In a novel published in Spain in the early 16th century, there was an island ruled by a queen named Calafia, with lots of gold. The people of New Spain thought that there was an island to the north of them, California, ruled by Calafia, and therefore California would be a land of gold. But Francisco de Ulloa, sent by Cortes, confirmed in 1539 that California, or what is now Baja California, is not an island, but a peninsula. To Cortes's dismay, the land was covered with cedars instead of gold. This exploration of Ulloa would become Cortes' final quest for California. Cortes was recalled by the Spanish emperor and left, leaving New Spain with Antonio de Mendoza as its first viceroy. Mendoza was also very interested in exploring the New World to the north by sea. Around this time, 4 survivors of the Narváez Florida expedition returned to Mexico City. They reported seeing the Golden City, and it was Viceroy Mendoza who sent Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's expedition. It was to establish a sea route through the Pacific Ocean to the Indonesian Spice Islands and China. The man Mendoza chose to lead the sea route expedition was Pedro de Alvarado, the Adelantado, or governor, of Guatemala. Alvarado turned to Cabrillo for support because Cabrillo was a skilled shipbuilder. Cabrillo trusted Alvarado and spent his fortune to build the ships. The San Salvador was built. But Alvarado died in battle. Cabrillo was left in debt. It's at this point that Mendoza entrusts Cabrillo with the exploration of California instead of Alvarado. He wanted him to find a faster sea route to China. Cabrillo's desire for exploration, coupled with financial concerns, led him to prepare. He built 3 ships, the San Salvador, the flagship, the La Victoria, and the San Miguel, a supply ship. Leaving his family behind in Guatemala, Cabrillo set sail from the port of Navidad. It was June 27, 1542. On September 17, he landed in Ensenada, in what is now Baja California, Mexico. This is a photo of Ensenada, which Trip Across visited on a Disney cruise. Cabrillo Statue still stands in Ensenada. And finally, on September 28, the ship pulled into San Diego, in what is now California, in what was then called Alta California. Cabrillo landed at what is now Point Loma. He was the first to discover the land and named it San Miguel. Here he encountered the indigenous people, the Camai. The Camai were wary of the Spanish, perhaps because they had heard stories of the Coronado expedition, which had swept through eastern New Mexico. Cabrillo left after making peace with the Camai. Even when they were attacked, they didn't fight back. Next, they discovered 2 large islands in what is now the Channel Islands. They were called La Victoria and San Salvador, after the ship. You might be wondering, none of these names that Cabrillo named after his ship remain today. That's because 60 years later, another Spaniard, Sebastian Vizcaino, set out on an expedition to California and renamed these lands. San Miguel became San Diego, La Victoria became San Clemente, and San Salvador became Santa Catalina. These names are still in use today. Cabrillo continued to find the present-day Santa Buenaventura, Santa Barbara, and Santa Rosa Island. Here he encountered the Chumash natives, and then proceeded north by sea via Point Concepcion. This was in October 1542. Over the next month or so, Cabrillo continued further north. And near what is now San Francisco, people think he may have gone as far as Point Reyes National Seashore. Anyway, he turned around here and decided to head south to spend the winter. So it was mid-November, 1542, and they came back to the Channel Islands in December. And on one of the islands in the Channel Islands, they ran into trouble. The Chumash natives, or the Tongva natives, attacked. And when Cabrillo heard his men screaming and yelling, he jumped off the ship at anchor and tried to run to help them. Instead, he ran into a rock, gashing his shin. At this point, it should have healed easily, but the wound continued to deteriorate and became a gangrene. Because of this, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo died on January 3, 1543. He was 46 years old. Before he died, Cabrillo told his second-in-command and captain of the La Victoria, Bartolomé Per, "Don't give up on the expedition, even if I die." Per fulfilled Cabrillo's wishes. The expedition traveled north to what is now Oregon. Much of the area they traveled through would later become the territory of California. Along the way, they found the present-day port of Monterey, and on April 14, 1543, Cabrillo's expedition returned to the port of Navidad from which they had departed. Cabrillo's expedition was the first European exploration of California, and was instrumental in defining the territory of California. Monterey and Navidad would become important ports for Spain's Pacific trade. In honor of this, the Cabrillo National Monument stands at Point Loma in San Diego. Trip Across took the kids to see it. There's a statue of Cabrillo here, and it's a cloudy day, which makes him look even more solemn. It's like he's saying, "Don't give up on the expedition, even if I die." One last story. This statue of Cabrillo wasn't made by an American. It was a gift from another country. Guess which country? It's Portugal. Isn't Cabrillo Spanish? Why is Portugal in the story? There's a reason. About 70 years after Cabrillo's death, a historian named Antonio de Herrera wrote down Cabrillo's name as Juan Rodrigues Cabrillo Portugueses. In other words, he wrote that Cabrillo was Portuguese. Because of this, the Portuguese believed that Cabrillo was Portuguese, so they donated a stone statue of Cabrillo discovering California for the 1939 San Francisco Exposition in California. But it arrived too late to be displayed at the fair. Instead, it was taken to San Diego, where Cabrillo first landed. San Diego was also home to a large Portuguese population. When the National Monument was later built, it was a natural fit for the statue to be located here as well. But Cabrillo was recently identified as Spanish. Historians have found a record of Cabrillo himself, who traveled to Spain in 1531, identifying himself as a native of Palma de Rio, near Seville, Spain. In fact, there was no record of Cabrillo being Portuguese anywhere else. One more thing. Historians have also been very curious about where the surname Cabrillo came from. It wasn't a common surname for Spaniards, although it was thought that it might have come from an occupational title. However, it has recently been discovered that the surname Cabrillo was used by Moriscos. For hundreds of years, until they were ousted by the Reconquista in the late 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula, home to Spain and Portugal, was dominated by Muslim forces. With the fall of Granada in 1492, all Muslim kingdoms collapsed, and the remaining Muslims were either driven out or forced to convert to Catholicism. Muslims who converted to Catholicism were called Moriscos. Perhaps Cabrillo was a descendant of the Moriscos. The region of Andalusia in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, including Seville, had the longest history of Muslim presence. As Spain became a Catholicized world, Cabrillo, a descendant of Morisco, may have seen an opportunity in the New World. He went to Cuba to hunt down anyone who disobeyed the viceroy, and he helped conquer the Aztec Empire. He established himself by conquering Guatemala, and he built ships to reach the Pacific. In California, the land of last chance, Cabrillo died unexpectedly. But Cabrillo lives on in countless place names and street names in California. His memory also lives on in the San Salvador, a ship he built off the coast of San Diego. If you're in San Diego on a Disney cruise, look for the San Salvador off the coast of the nearby San Diego Maritime Museum. That's it for today's story from Trip Across. Thanks for listening. See you on our next trip.